Good morning. I hope everybody's having a good day, and I hope everybody's ready for me to commit philosophy without a license again. Please don't tell Dr. Anders. One of the things that I think the play is about is this idea of virtue. In fact, we talked about this earlier when I was assigning the paper, that some of the subject matter of the play included morality, and I think that in this case is virtue. Perhaps it included the idea of liberty. Justice is certainly part of it. And then there's the idea of appearance versus reality. Once again, we have a character in disguise. Agency, the idea of who can take control of one's life and how one goes about doing that. And certainly the idea of the role of women, how women fit into the, uh, you know, the society that Shakespeare is writing about. When we talk about virtue, I think a lot of times we talk about virtue in the sense of, you know, doing good things or whatever. But I think one of the things that Shakespeare is teasing out of this play is this idea of how does one determine whether one is a good person or not. And I think there are people who talk about virtue in the sense of using virtue to make that determination. I'm going to start with just very, very basic overviews of how one determines a good person or a good or a just action. One of the ways one goes about doing that is that if it follows the rules, for example, thou shalt not steal. So if you have not stolen, then that is a good action. Okay. If the rule is give to the poor and you've dropped some cash into the Salvation Army pot at Christmas time, that would count as a good action. There could be the idea that the rule is on an accepted list, or the rule is handed down by God, who wrote the accepted list, for example, the Ten Commandments. One can argue that if one doesn't believe in God, that all rational beings would want this rule, and that leads us into what's called the categorical imperative. Act on the maxim through which you can at the same time will that would be a universal law. Maxim is just a rule. So the only rules that one should make categorical, absolute, are the rules that you would want for everybody to have a universal law. For example, the treat others as you would want to be treated rule seems to be pretty universal. There's the Bible has a version of it, Confucius has a version of it. It seems to be pretty universal. The second one is so act as to use humanity both in your own person and in the person of every other, always at the same time as an end, never simply as a means. In other words, I am not supposed to treat you students as a means to make money. Or I am not supposed to treat you as a means to gratify my ego. All right? And you are supposed to treat each other as ends unto yourselves, not as a means to an end. All right? Whoever you're sitting beside in class is not a means to all of the answers. They are an end unto themselves. You should treat them as the end, not as a means to an end. And then you are supposed to act as if you're a lawmaking member of the universal kingdom of ends. That you are an end unto yourself, and you are to act as a member of that end. The other way people go about doing things is saying, forget the rules. Sometimes the rules have bad outcomes, and we should look only at the outcomes. So an action is right if it promotes the best consequences. And how do we know the best consequences? Well, according to a utilitarian, the best consequences are those in which happiness is maximized. And again, happiness, I think, needs to go beyond the giddy, giggly version of happiness that I think we tend to look at and we tend to define happiness as. And I think we need to look at it in a sense as, fulfillment. And I've talked about that several times before. How does one get to have a fulfilled life? All right. So does this produce a sense of fulfillment? The virtue folk talk about the idea that you should look at the principles and see that perhaps both utilitarianism and deontology, the rule-based one, have failed. And they want to be an alternative to both of them. And so what these virtue people do, and why I think this applies to Measure for Measure, and why I am talking about it right now, is it focuses not on the rules, not on the results necessarily, but it focuses on the moral agents. It focuses on the people and how they act and how they behave. It takes a look at, are they doing this for the right reasons? Are they acting as a typical moral agent would act in a given situation? We're looking at the moral agent, not the rules, not the consequences. We are looking at the character. And I know you've heard me say it 1,000 times or more: character, conflict, connection, and theme. We're going to look at the character. We're going to look at the moral agent. All right, we're not going to look at one's duty. We're not going to look, which would be following the rules. We're not going to look at utility, which would be the idea of getting the greatest good for the greatest number, the greatest happiness for the greatest number. We're going to look at what sort of people are we dealing with. And I think, again, this is going to be a play about virtue, not just virtue as in sexual chastity or, promiscuity, which would be a lack of virtue. We're going to talk about virtue in the sense of what does the moral agent do? I know I'm beating that on a dead horse there by repeating that over and over, but I think one of the reasons this play prompted me to take a look at virtue and do this presentation on Philosophy Without a License is that we're going to look at people who do things that have good consequences, who do things that have bad consequences, who do things that follow rules or break rules. But I think we have to look at, are they doing what a moral person would do? How do we determine their character? How do we determine their virtue? And so we'll take a quick look at the virtue ethics side of this. An action is right if it's what a virtuous agent would characteristically do in the circumstances. In other words, acting in character, acting as the virtuous agent always would act. The premise 1A defines the virtuous agent is one who has and exercises the virtues. The one who characteristically, not perfectly, because no human is perfect, but usually in most circumstances acts on the sense of the virtues. And to define the virtue, because this seems to be an exercise in definition, you can talk about a character trait the human needs for eudaimonia, which is to flourish and live well. All right. But I think we might just look at, does it fall into the mean? In other words, we can have courage. We can lack courage, which would make us a coward, or we can have too much courage and, bring a 2-inch folding knife to a gunfight full of machine guns. That's probably not the smartest thing in the world. We can be generous. If we are not generous and we lack it, we are stingy. But there's a point where we go too far and we're prodigal. We waste it. Okay? We can be friendly, or we can be grumpy, or we can be major league suck ups. And we've had several of those in the plays. We can make jokes. We can make jokes to the point where we're kind of boorish, or not, excuse me, we can act like Malvolio and be kind of boorish, or we can be buffoons like Sir Toby. I think all of those are there. And then, so is there a mean in there in these plays? Are people acting on it? Also, are people acting in the right way with other sorts of virtues? 3 conditions. Person must know the quality of his or her acts. It must be a choice. And it must reflect a firm and settled disposition. In other words, it's not the choice for this one time. It's the choice that people would continually make under these situations. Then Aristotle, since he's the one who came up with a lot of this stuff, says that there's a temperate and virtuous person who does the right thing and succeeds without conflict. I don't think that's very many of us. The continent person wants to do what's right and usually does so, but there's conflicts. And then there's a person who wants to do right but doesn't. And then there's a licentious, intemperate person who doesn't want to do right and usually doesn't. So we should be taking a look at how are these people acting and behaving in the sense of virtue in the play. I think there's a couple of things here that probably don't add to the play, but that I should cover. Number one, I think it's important to talk about the fact that virtues are made perfect by habit. Okay. And, again, we'll just do the quote. This then is the case with the virtues also. By doing the acts that we do in our transactions with other men, we become just or unjust. The same is true of appetites and feelings of anger. Some men become temperate and good-tempered, others self-indulgent and irascible. And I just pronounced that wrong, I apologize. By behaving in one way or another in the appropriate circumstances. It's a sense of habit. And then finally, since Aristotle mentions justice, and the play is going to be concerned with justice, I do think that any conversation about justice has to include the idea that only justice is an unlimited good. People can want too much liberty and too much equality, but it's probably impossible to have too much justice. And so for the daily writing, just pick a virtue and tell me why you think it's important. There were a bunch on that list on the slide. There are other ones that you can think of. Just pick a virtue. Tell me why you think it's important. Hope to see you in class on Friday.